The President of the United States has signed an executive order meant to improve policing. It's Donald Trump's response to the huge outcry over anti-black racism and police violence following the deaths of George Floyd last month. The order will create a database to track police with a history of using excessive force. It will also give police departments a financial incentive to adopt best practices. Trump made no mention of racism. Here he is speaking in the White House Rose Garden.
Under the executive order I'm signing today, we will prioritize federal grants from the Department of Justice to police departments that seek independent credentialing, certifying that they meet high standards, and in fact, in certain cases, the highest standard. That's where they do the best, on the use of force and de-escalation training. For example, many believe that proper training might have prevented the tragic deaths of Antoine Rose and Botham Jean. As part of this new credentialing process, chokeholds will be banned, except if an officer's life is at risk.
Let's go to Washington now, and Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason. Jeff, we heard a little there from the president and some broad strokes in the intro. Walk us through the details.
Sure. So the executive order basically takes a position on a few controversial issues that Republicans and Democrats haven't entirely agreed on in this town. One is, and this came at part of the clip that you just played, the executive order would basically encourage police not to use chokeholds, would ban chokeholds unless the officer is his or her life were at risk. In general, sort of in a broad way of looking at it, this order would tie discretionary grants, federal grant money, to best practices, as you said, by police departments. It would encourage police departments to increase and use higher standards with regard to the use of force. It would create that database that you suggested, which would be, or that you mentioned, which would basically try to keep people who are considered bad police officers from jumping from one department to another without the next department knowing what their history is. And then lastly, it would help or it would seek to put social workers and those types of individuals out with police officers to help deal with cases related to homelessness and drug addiction instead of always sending just a law enforcement professional.
Yeah, we run a number of those programs here in Canada. This comes as protesters across the U.S. are calling for the police to be defunded. How is the president responding to those calls?
Well, the president has definitely responded negatively to those calls, but insofar as he's rejected those calls, I guess if you look at it from a political perspective, it's actually been somewhat positive for him that sort of left-leaning activists have called for that, because it's provided a foil for this president after a couple of weeks in which he's received a lot of criticism himself for his own response to the protests. So by coming out and emphasizing law and order and saying we're not going to defund police departments, and also suggesting, he didn't do this today so much, but some others have in the Republican Party, suggesting that the Democratic Party broadly is trying to defund police. That will be a way for him to try and motivate his base, because as we know, he's running for re-election in November.
Action, Jeff, to the executive order.
My own reaction? Well, I can't give you a reaction.
No,
as a
not
reporter,
yours. Not yours. What's the reaction?
The reaction broadly. I'm sorry, you got cut out for just a second. It depends on who you ask. Critics, including Democrats such as Vice President Joe Biden, who's the nominee for the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, said it was insufficient. So did House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. One other civil rights group said that it might be useful to tie funding and incentives for funding to police departments in this way. Republicans, meanwhile, both Republicans and Democrats are working on legislation on the Hill, and Republicans were more positive about this action. But in general, I think there's a question mark about this isn't everything, and even the president isn't saying it's everything that needs to be done. They're looking for a legislative solution or a legislative action as well, and that can only come with some compromise between lawmakers on the Hill.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason in Washington.